Hello, Daniel. Today I'm happy to have you here to speak through Tide 10 Talk. Wanted to take an opportunity to ask you a few questions and get some understanding about yourself, your professional journey, and your experience with the topic of ESG. With that, how about an introduction? Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do at Wilshire?
Yeah, sure. Well, look, thank you, Ron. I'm really thrilled to be on this platform. And actually, I want to thank you in particular for your interest in ESG topics, particularly someone like you with a legal and compliance background. We need more ESG champions like you. So thank you for that. My role is Senior Vice President for Responsible Investment Research and Consulting at Wilshire Associates, and I chair our ESG and Diversity Committee.
You've recently joined Wilshire. That's a bit of your professional journey. You were previously at British Telecom, but you've recently relocated to Los Angeles. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Why did I move to LA?
Yeah.
Hollywood was calling. Sadly, not for me, as much as I'd like to think one day my acting talents would be recognized. The call was for my wife to work on Emmy award-winning TV show called Barry for HBO.
Wow, that's going to be exciting.
But following her over here to the US, I became what's known in some circles as the trailing spouse. So I thought that was quite an interesting title.
Someone's background like yourself, I'm sure you have a multitude of professional opportunities. Why Wilshire?
Actually, while I was in the UK, I spent time exchanging notes on ESG best practices with global asset owners, one of whom was a Wilshire client. So I got to know the then president of Wilshire Consulting, Andrew Junkin, who's now the Chief Investment Officer at the Rhode Island Employee Retirement Plan. Andrew, for those that don't know him, had a vision then, 2015, Wilshire 2016, Wilshire was signing up to the UN Principles for Responsible Investment. He had a vision for ESG and for diversity as well, and had the foresight to see they were fast becoming more mainstream issues for US asset owners. And I convinced him and the rest of Wilshire that I was the right person to help lead Wilshire's ESG advisory business.
From my understanding is you've had a lot of experience with this particular subject matter, ESG, and you've seen an evolution of ESG and ESG integration. How do you feel that discussion around ESG is evolving and maturing? You were referencing your conversation, Mr. Junkin, and around sort of that connective fabric. What have you seen in your time in the industry around this conversation?
Yeah, so I've been working in the ESG space before the term was coined. I was a public servant working at Her Majesty's Treasury. I was Chief of Staff for now Lord, then Sir, Nick Stern, on his landmark review on the economics of climate change. For those that know it, the review found the benefits of addressing climate change sooner than later far outweigh the costs. And I think in many ways, to your question, the evolution of that framework, particularly for those of us working in the ESG space, is very relevant in that we're trying to proactively educate asset owners on the benefits and costs of preparing investment portfolios for the economic, social, and environmental disruption from issues like climate change sooner rather than later. So I think what I learned back then 15 years ago still applies, and it's an incredibly exciting growth space at the moment.
We've definitely seen a lot more energy around the discussion and a lot more focus by managers and market participants, vendors, and what have you, trying to add meat to the conversation and kind of an articulation that everyone can universally communicate around these issues about. In these discussions, I've often heard focus in regards of ESG on the governance aspect of ESG and the environmental aspect of ESG. 2020 has been a very interesting year, and there have been a lot of things that have been happening around complex social issues that are unprecedented. One of the conversations that we've seen in 2020 that has gained a lot of focus has been around the S in ESG, the social aspect. What are some of your thoughts around human capital, the protection of employees, and ESG factors and the magnitude of the moment of 2020?
A few years ago, investors may have said, look, I get the G, maybe the E, but I'm not interested in the S because there's an ethical or values orientated judgment to be made, or isn't the S about companies purely operating in emerging or frontier markets where they might be concerned around issues such as sourcing minerals from conflict zones or from child labor. But as we grapple now with systemic risks like COVID-19, it's becoming increasingly self-evident that the management of all ESG risks, including, as you say, the social issues such as employee health and safety and supply chains, can all have a material impact on asset values. And in many ways, COVID-19 has brought some of those social issues much, much closer to home for a lot of us. We're very aware that now more than ever, companies do not operate in a vacuum. ESG issues are interconnected with each other and with financial issues. And now in the US, we have the beginning of a sort of redefinition of the corporation, insofar as last year the US Roundtable for Business repurposed the definition to serve corporations for the benefit of all stakeholders. So that's customers, employees, suppliers, communities, in addition to shareholders. So now we're just beginning to understand how well companies are positioned in terms of managing all stakeholders, but also the value at risk for those that make big blunders in terms of managing their social capital, in terms of the skills and the talent of their employees.
And you were talking about workplace safety. I think that's one of the things that's been a hot topic here, particularly in Los Angeles. A lot of conversations around workplace safety in response to COVID and people being concerned about what the new workplace environment is and things that impact access to internet and services and things of that nature that allow people to do their jobs. I think in the context of the way that people work, we all kind of commuting from these various places. We go to this building, we do our job, and then we retreat for the day. And now we've been thrust into this new world where people have to account for things such as childcare, elder care, and doing their job, the technology available, whether or not they have reliable internet service, whether or not they live in conflict zones. There are actually some employees that we've had at our firm who have lived in places geographically that have been subject to some of the protests and civil unrest. And that's actually impacted their ability to do work. And these are things we now have to think about as a firm about where our people are at and to sort of plan around in this sort of brave new world in 2020. It's interesting because one of the other things that we've talked about in our ESG discussions are sort of the standardization of the conversation and a way to look at these factors in a way that is universal and understood by other participants, such that when our information or about what we're doing and about what our journey is about in the ESG aspect, that's something that's easily understood and digestible by recipients of that information. You've done a lot of work with CFA Institute. Could you possibly speak to your experiences around that, and particularly about what the CFA Institute may be doing in the ESG space?
There's clearly a huge amount of activity and initiatives, products being launched, best practice codes being signed up to by the investment management community. There's clearly a lot of questions still out there in terms of the emergence of an ESG standard. There's still some confusion, as we know, about the different approaches that are being adopted in terms of ESG, namely exclusion, integration, and impact, and then perhaps underlying all those, the whole area around active ownership or stewardship and proxy voting. And so really the goal of the CFA working group which is now, by the way, just last week, so that was at the end of August 2020, launched a consultation that the working group developed a consultation around labeling standards for ESG investment products. So are products coming to the market doing what they say on the can? And really that's a big part of, for example, the Global Investment Performance Standards, the GIPS standards that perhaps could be applied here is, is this fund, are they saying that they're looking to influence one of the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, or are they actually just excluding a few stocks in some industries? So I think labeling, transparency, disclosure are all part of this move going forward to give more credibility and transparency to different types of investors around the approaches to ESG that are being adopted in the marketplace.
And I think you've even heard here in the U.S., the regulator has kind of sounded the horn. The SEC has made it clear that this is one of their priorities, and sort of the evaluation of how managers who hold themselves out to be as ESG managers or managing ESG products will start to be evaluated as well. And that standardization should be helpful both in that inquiry and also in allowing people to prepare for those types of inquiries. You've had the benefit of seeing various managers and their approaches to this complex ESG sort of conundrum. Can you tell us about the lens that you use to look at managers when you're evaluating them around ESG? You noted earlier some things like negative screening lists or exclusion lists aren't necessarily ESG solutions, but maybe you can share a little insight about how you think about that.
This is certainly in response to a lot of asset owners asking the question, how do we know what good ESG integration looks like by the investment managers that we work with? And really the goal of our exercise here is to distinguish between managers that are talking the talk from those that are walking the walk. So this is about using ESG manager evaluations to help better inform the manager research and selection process. So we've categorized managers on our buy list, our focus list of strategies into three groups. Okay. And essentially these three groups kind of follow the ESG maturity curve. So neutral are those managers which maybe have intentions over the next few years to integrate ESG over time, or they say that ESG really isn't anything new for them. They don't necessarily see the benefit of putting a spotlight on ESG by developing, policies and process and investing in people. So the next group up are the integrators. Again, following this maturity curve, they may be 3 to 5 years in, and they've started to embed ESG into their practices, maybe also into their reporting, and can demonstrate case studies and examples of how ESG is influencing portfolio construction. And then the next group up, the ESG leaders, set the highest standard of best practice in ESG integration by taking into account ESG risks and opportunities in every part of the investment process. And there's clarity over how that information and analysis is being used in security valuation, in portfolio construction, in risk management, and then in reporting to clients.
Yeah, we noted earlier that 2020 has really accelerated a lot of these conversations, one of those being around diversity, equity, and inclusion. When you're thinking about managers and how they show up in this particular context, what are some of the things that you're interested in understanding about a manager in the diversity, equity, and inclusion context?
Wilshire is very active now, particularly analysing and putting forward diverse owned managers in front of our clients. You may have seen we adopted the so-called Rooney Rule. So unless a client opts out, we're for every short list of managers putting in front of them a diverse owned strategy. In many ways, what we're trying to do is, I think like a lot of others, is build a much better understanding of, again, what are the benefits of diversity to an investment process, to an investment team? How do we know what good diversity looks like? Similarities to ESG to that extent. And so about 18 months ago, we went out and surveyed about 500 plus investment managers to ask them lots of questions about how they define diversity, what disclosures they might make or might be willing to make around diversity and inclusion. Now, I think there's definitely a very rich discussion to be had. Certainly some of the feedback on this survey was around the benefits of diversity of thought and diversity of opinion in terms of improving the investment decision-making culture at an investment firm. So, avoiding groupthink, some colleagues playing more devil's advocate roles to challenge some of the conventional wisdom. And so by having this diversity of thought, that there came across a very strong view from investment managers that could really help improve investment outcomes. But clearly one of the challenges, how do you measure diversity of what kind of metrics are we looking for? And we found that actually there probably is quite a strong positive correlation between metrics such as gender and race, and then leading to diversity of thought. But there are also other diversity metrics beyond race and gender that go into the mix of considering diversity of thought. So lots of discussion about this so-called area of cognitive diversity, as well as us building a much better sense of how underrepresented voices and traditionally voices that have not been included in investment decision-making, how that's going to change in the industry.
I think that's very helpful. And I guess given the fact that this is for the Tide Conference, very on brand. Well, Daniel, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for spending time with us today to talk through ESG and your various thoughts on all these things. Learned a lot and it's been very informative, and just wanted to say thank you.
Well, thank you. And thank you very much to Tide for all the fantastic work that it's doing. And we're very much looking forward to continuing to support that agenda.